Hi, and welcome to the recorded webinar for the Risk Source Lunch and Learn series. This recording is of the content from the webinar on Wednesday, May 20th. Our topic was to discuss or not to discuss performance and compensation. So when we think about the performance review process, what I've observed from my own experience as an employee, I knew that at my organization, the day that I received my performance review, I always found out at the end of that conversation what type of increase I was getting. And so what I learned and also observed from talking to my colleagues is that we really didn't care too much about the feedback. We were pretty confident it was going to be positive. So walking into that meeting, all we really wanted to know was, how much more money are we going to make? What are you giving to me? And we really lost a little bit of the magic in understanding the value of that feedback our manager was providing to us. So that certainly is a downside of blending the two together. But the answer to can you make it work this way is absolutely yes. So we'll talk about that a little bit more throughout our webinar this morning. So a couple things that we're going to talk about is one, understanding how we even got to this conundrum and trying to debate, do we do them together or do we separate the topics of compensation and performance evaluations? Then we're also going to look at kind of the pros and cons to why maybe some organizations do it that way. We're going to talk about best practices and some things to think about when communicating compensation to your employees. And then briefly, just because of our current environment, we will talk a little bit about COVID-19 and just some good things to think about what the implications of that are on the overall culture and potentially even your communication to your employees. So in thinking about how we got here and how we got to a performance-based feedback system, it really goes back to World War I. So the military was creating a merit-based system, and it was based on individual accountability. How did you as a person, as an individual participant, perform? And then, at the end of that war, our veterans returned to work, and what we saw was a blending of that system and belief into our workplaces. So in the 1940s, over half of US companies were using performance evaluations as a method to allocate rewards to employees. So, obviously the best performers were going to get the largest or the most rewards, and we would see a trickle down from there based on where you fell in that overall ranking. In the 1980s, we saw Jack Welch champion forced rankings. So looking at the top population or percentage, they received, a larger reward. The middle was where we would accommodate them. And then the bottom performers were really where we saw wanting to move them out. And I can remember, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was doing a ton of stacked ranking with organizations that I was supporting from an HR perspective. And our rule at the organization was that anybody, and we used kind of like a green, then a yellow. Yellow was they're okay, they're adequate performers, and we kind of split that yellow group up as people who we really wanted to coach coach up, and then some folks who we wanted to coach out of the organization. But our rule was that the folks in the bottom or the red area, they needed to be on that performance improvement plan. And I saw managers essentially almost having to debate with me sometimes, and it was not effective if they didn't agree that their employee needed to be on a PIP. So that was definitely an interesting scenario that I had to work through. But then in the 2000s, we saw, through a lot of different changes we went through as an economy, organizations were getting a lot flatter. So one supervisor would have many more direct reports. And what this created was a really big time constraint. Managers weren't able to, be with their employees all the time. It took a lot longer to write a huge performance evaluation. And from my own personal experience, I heard managers, really struggling when I would ask them to complete, this really difficult essay form type of performance review for employees that weren't necessarily going through an effective goal setting process at the beginning of the year. But we needed them to finish that on time so that we could determine how to allocate that merit pool and give people compensation raises. So there was definitely a time constraint, and it was a huge stressor for our supervisors. In 2011, we really started to hear about organizations dropping the performance evaluation for more frequent feedback systems. And this is something, if you were at our earlier webinar this year, we talked about high impact performance management. And really that system that I like to use is based on this exact thought. Very frequent, almost employee-driven check-in conversations that build upon each other all year long, so that at the end of the year, when you have an annual look back or an annual review, the feedback is there. Nothing is going to be a surprise, and ultimately your review should be kind of written for you because of all of the small tidbits of work you've put into it throughout the year. And then finally, in 2016, we really saw increased momentum towards feedback-based performance management systems, where again, those environments are quickly changing. We're seeing a much more nimble organization, again, based on the economy that we had, and I'm going to certainly say pre-COVID. For this, it was extremely low unemployment. We really needed to be engaged with our employees as managers and leaders. As we see more millennials in the workplace, we know that they really value that constant feedback. And what we've seen is more of a focus towards feedback, but we haven't effectively addressed the question of where is the right moment and right time to talk about compensation in these high touch type of environments. So the result of this is that, we certainly have evaluation systems that are helping to hold employees accountable, and they're guiding the the organization with compensation decisions, because managers are going to have almost an easier read on who are those top performers, who is maybe earning a higher pay rate, who's working hard for that increase versus who isn't, who I'm coaching, maybe out of the organization. And our evaluation systems, again, are more feedback and goals-based, and it certainly influences pay decisions, but we don't have a good structure around it. So that's hopefully what we're really going to address today. So in thinking about why many organizations choose to combine these two things together, where especially now it may not feel easy, it may not make sense, but it condenses multiple conversations into one. So again, our organizations are still flat. We may have a supervisor with multiple direct reports. When we do that annual review or annual conversation, it still might be the best time and feel like it makes sense to talk about how the whole year went and then provide a compensation reward. This can also be a much easier process to manage for the supervisor. But a lot of the feedback I would get is, geez, it takes me so long to meet with all of my employees. If I'm going to be scheduling meetings with them all this week, can I just do both? And a lot of times we see organizations that still do believe they have a pay for performance system. So why wouldn't we do this? It makes sense. And I certainly don't disagree with any of those reasons or arguments, if you will. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons. So certainly I can't hear from you right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience. So I had already shared some of the cons. When you aren't existing in an environment of frequent feedback and having an environment of open communication between a manager and employee on what's going well, what needs to change, what should we keep doing, we're eliminating that feedback. And also, I think it creates almost a fear or defensiveness from employees because they aren't used to receiving feedback and may not look at it as this gift a manager or a supervisor is providing to me because they care about me. And this is a way for me to improve my overall performance and be successful. So, just a lack of performance-based conversations and appreciation of feedback is a huge con that I would say. A pro, certainly from an organization that builds a budget and does allocation, based on department size and forecasting, having accurate financial results is a huge pro in my mind. It also is a time saver for managers, which I think is really helpful. Some other things that I think make sense is it's never really a surprise. It may not also seem like a taboo conversation if you're having a topic of money and income as a scheduled agenda item for an employee. They may open up more about what their financial goals are with a manager or a supervisor, which helps to understand what really are those motivators for your employees. And I am definitely a believer, and I think a lot of us still are, that a pay for performance environment makes sense, right? We want those high performers to feel like for working extremely hard, they are receiving a financial reward, and that they're not working super hard and then seeing a 3% peanut butter spread of a merit pool being given to people who slack off and aren't pulling their weight. That can be a huge de-incentivizer for those top performers. So keeping that pay for performance mentality alive, in my mind, is a big pro for this. So we'll move on a little bit, because the other impact that sometimes can come out of a blended performance evaluation system when it's not done with effective explanation and feedback from managers is that you have a hierarchy situation. And what we get is a blame-oriented culture, right? So in this little comic here, the coffee is saying that a coffee is only good as its coffee maker, right? So, hey manager, I can only be as good as, all the things that you give to me, So the coffee is saying, hey, don't blame me. I'm only as good as, all of the things you do and provide to me. So if a manager isn't providing what that employee feels is the right amount of support, if the team members aren't pulling their weight, then we're going to have this blame across the department, across the team of why somebody isn't effective, because we're missing all of that feedback along the way. So we also pulled some research from supervisors, and this came from two different sources here. So, supervisors don't necessarily see the value in evaluation systems. So these evaluation systems are, where maybe an HR person is saying, you have to use this scale, you have to give a ranking, we have to know what the overall score is, because that helps us understand how to allocate a financial reward. So to a manager, they may not see the value in all of the processes and stress and forms they're required to fill out in order to ultimately make a compensation decision. And really, when we think about the amount of time a supervisor has to spend on the process, they really consider it to be an ineffective use of their time. I always, want to talk to managers about, I want to help you get back to your day job. Sitting in an office writing reports about performance on a computer really isn't a quote unquote value add. When we think about a people manager, they're not able to observe, they're not able to be out there coaching and rooting for their employees, even having those moments to observe and provide that real-time feedback to their employees. So I can completely understand why that perception exists. So let's consider the assumptions evaluation systems make about motivating employees. So we're saying, hey, well, by providing a score and an evaluation, this means that rewards or punishments, not giving somebody an increase, is going to work. If I have to have a conversation with an employee and say, I'm sorry, you didn't rank high enough to get the full merit this year, the thought is that's going to make them want to work harder the next year. Also, focusing reviews on past performance or behavior, it's effective. So let's pretend that it's the beginning of the year, it's January. I'm going to be providing my employee with their full annual review for the last calendar year. And is that really an effective way to start my new calendar year? Am I going to necessarily be motivating an employee? And then also, this other assumption is that these once-a-year systems are sufficient to influence changing employee behavior and improving performance. And again, if you've participated in any of our other webinars, I've talked about performance management and that high impact, frequent, monthly touch bases at least is really important. And we're talking about 15 minutes a month where an employee and manager check in with one another. So think about your organization's focus. Are you focusing on an individual or group accountability? Also, do you want to reward based on an individual's, what he or she is personally bringing to the table, or rewarding people as a group? This is where I had mentioned earlier a peanut butter spread. Do you want to just take that budget, spread it out 3%? Or do you want to be able to reward people based on their true merit, what they provided? So I also think it's important for you to consider if a system that does a one-year look back, get your organization where it needs to be. So if you only talk about what's going really well, what's working, and what needs to change once, is it reasonable to expect that those things are actually going to happen once an employee leaves your office? My opinion, for what it's worth, is that no, it's absolutely not enough. It's not going to be effective or sufficient because you're just not talking about it enough. It's not going to be a focused area for employees and frankly for managers. So another thing to consider is how you can use the goals and the overall strategic plan of your organization to help determine the best fit evaluation system. It's probably also going to give you a big indicator of how and when pay is actually discussed with employees. So if managers are meeting on a monthly or biweekly quick, 10 minutes, 15 minutes with their employees to check in, they're always up to speed on priorities, goals, and sharing effective feedback. It probably does make sense for a couple of those meetings to be more formal compensation-based discussions where you understand how an employee feels about their compensation. What are their goals? Do they understand why and how they're compensated? And is this, biannual schedule enough? So let's kind of change gears into the methods to communicate compensation. So one recommendation is to develop a compensation philosophy. And I'll give you some examples of these in a couple of moments. But essentially, the compensation philosophy communicates to employees what you believe about pay and what your goals are for the way you compensate your employees. So if you believe in pay for performance, if you believe in rewarding the group versus the individual, that should be a relevant point in your compensation philosophy. Also, a great method is to develop salary ranges and then assign positions within each of those pay range or pay bands based on that market data. That's going to help tell you if you pay your employees in an effective and competitive way for like jobs and like organizations in your market or even nationally. And it also helps you have, again, an open and honest conversation with an employee about how they're compensated. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Similarly, you can use benchmarking data to review employee pay on a regular interval. So this is certainly in conjunction with market data, but basically you can make sure that you don't have somebody, and we see this really with a long tenured employee. After so long, their compensation can start to fall lower in a range because they haven't been adjusted as the market or the benchmark has changed. So you can always make sure you're providing a fair and equitable rate based on the job and the role that they're performing. Another great tip is to utilize total reward statements, and we'll talk about all of these things a little bit more. But these reports or these statements ultimately outline what that total compensation is for an employee. So it's more than just the money that we give them, right, that they earn. It's the taxes, it's the cost of benefits, it's the different 401k investments that an employer is making for an employee. And so it really shows the value above and beyond just that paycheck. So I had mentioned compensation philosophy. Here's a couple of different examples. So our organization is committed to providing an attractive, flexible, and market-based total compensation program tied to performance and aligned with stakeholder interest. That's clear. It tells us what we want to do, but it may not make sense to the employee. To me, this one seems more of a marketing department type of compensation philosophy. So number 2, our organization's compensation structure supports the company's mission and core values. This could be a really great comp philosophy depending on how clear the core values are and the mission, how invested it is in the culture, and if employees really use these as a daily part of their work life and their behavior. My favorite philosophy on this slide is the third one because it's super clear, it's easy to understand. So our organization will pay competitive base salaries, attract and retain competent employees, and provide each employee the opportunity to achieve financial rewards directly related to their performance and achievement. So I know that at this company, if I'm an employee, I'm going to get a competitive base salary. It's going to be appropriate to the market, the job I do, my years of experience. But I also know that they're going to be, attracting and working hard to retain competent employees. So if I'm not proving myself to be competent, that could be an issue. Performance is important at this organization. And then finally, I know that on top of my base salary, I'm going to have an opportunity to earn additional financial rewards. So maybe it's a bonus or some type of incentive pay that's directly related to how I individually do. So a good indicator to me is if I am at this company and I'm not earning a financial reward, I may not be performing effectively. I may need to really evaluate if this is the right organization for me, or talk with my manager about what I need to do to improve my performance. So another question that we get frequently is what an organization should share about a compensation structure. And again, this really depends on the management style and the culture that you have at an organization. If you have a really immature culture and maybe your managers aren't confident to have an open and honest or maybe a difficult conversation with an employee, it makes it hard to have a really transparent environment with compensation. So as you define your compensation philosophy, it's probably going to help you understand what you want to share. So if we think back to these 3 sample philosophies, I'm going to say that number 1 and number 2 are probably not extremely open and honest, but in number 3, we're saying we're going to pay you a competitive base salary. So that probably would indicate that an employer is going to be able to tell an employee why exactly the base salary is competitive, where they rank in a pay band, and why a reward is being allocated based on performance. So it would need to be pretty clear. So before you send a a pay range out, think about employee awareness. Are our employees able to understand what this means? Can they use this information the way we expect them to use it? Or is it going to cause mass chaos? Understand how this could impact overall employee appreciation. Are employees going to feel like they're not valued or appreciated at the organization because comp is the only way that you currently do it? And also understand if this is going to be the right way to motivate employees, or what you need to add to your management approach to continue motivating and coaching the right way. So salary ranges. The pros of having these, and frankly communicating them, is that it encourages pay equity among employees with clearly defined ranges. You're not gonna have people all out of whack, paid all across the different amounts. You're gonna see them somewhat bunched within a minimum, a midpoint, and a maximum based on the type of work that they do. It also opens the door to having really great conversations related to pay, and it is a big trust earner for employees. I love to be able to have a conversation about a pay range, why this is our offer to you, why we believe as an organization that this is fair, and allowing that employee to engage in that conversation. It becomes not a one-way, but a two-way conversation. And this is also, again, a really effective use or a tool to manage a salary budget. It's really a lot easier to forecast bonuses, forecast increases when you have some semblance of a goal of where people should be paid. Some cons that you might see is, again, a lack of understanding on how the ranges weren't developed. So you need to share that. If you don't, it can cause frustration or it can cause distrust. It does require the ranges to be analyzed and closely looked at on a consistent basis. So my rule of thumb is, at least every 18 months, unless there's been some very large economic impact or swing that you've experienced. And this also can limit an employer's flexibility on salary decisions. And here is an example. So I once worked at an organization where we had a very, very long-term executive administrative assistant. She had been in this position for, let's say 20 years. She was fantastic at her job, but she was paid at the maximum for her salary grade. And her managers and she was really frustrated that when it came time for an annual merit, this excellent performer didn't get a salary increase, but instead received that, maximum percentage, but she received it as a lump sum bonus, and her annual increase wasn't impacting that salary. So for those accountants out there, that percentage wasn't an amortization and growing amount. Her wages were flat and she was just getting a lump sum bonus. That was really frustrating to her because she felt like it wasn't a true reward like others in the organization were receiving. And she was a star performer. So when thinking about a total reward statements, again, this is a picture of the annual investment a company makes in each employee. It can really help the employee understand what those true values of company benefits and perks are. So if you provide parking for an employee in a parking lot downtown, that should be on your total rewards statement. If you're providing a monthly yoga class free of charge to employees, feel free to put the cost of that per employee on that total rewards. It is an investment and a benefit above pay that you are providing. And this also can help aid in retention and employee morale because you're really showing in one nice, clear picture all of the things that you're doing for your employees. A couple rules of thumb with total rewards statements. I like to include, a manager conversation where we go over exactly what these are, what managers are expected to reinforce and share with employees, as well as, some FAQs. We want to prepare our managers before we send things to their employees. I also recommend that either the HR department or the managers have a conversation, or like maybe it's an all hands call with employees where they're able to give a sample, go through how to read, how to understand it, what this form or statement means to them, and then provide employees with times that you'll be available, to answer questions or walk through somebody's statement with them. If they aren't able to understand it, it's not going to be effective and may cause more harm than good if somebody misinterprets the information they're being given. So the HR Elements best practice recommendation is that these are parallel processes. So you have a performance feedback process. And again, I've talked about it a couple of times today. It's a high impact performance-based feedback process with manager and employee with an annual, more formal summary review at the end of the year. And it is running parallel to a compensation program where employees and managers are having conversations about compensation. We understand why an employee is paid a certain way and what an employee's goals are for increasing their compensation. So this creates, this annual process where we check on overall professional development. It includes a career discussion. What are the employee's goals? What is their ultimate career aspiration? Are there other departments he or she wants to work in? And an annual summary review. And then again, that compensation needs to talk about the progress in a range. If you are new to the organization, is it really reasonable to expect to be paid at that midpoint or maximum of a pay range? Probably not, but let's talk about why. Understand compensation equity, so knowing why an employee is receiving something, and also making sure that when you market price positions each year, you're knowing that your job description is up to date. So that opens another conversation with employees to make sure, is your job description accurate? Do you agree that these are the things that you do? You need to have that job description before you go market price a role, because you need to make sure you're market pricing the right role. So the rubber really hits the road with compensation and performance with communication. So typically, employees want to increase their earnings. And if somebody who isn't a strong performer, they're probably not going to be at the top of your list for an increase. So that compensation discussion needs to be, it needs to make sense with the feedback they've been receiving on performance. If you're giving somebody performance feedback that they need to improve and things aren't going well, and then it's time for that annual merit and they get the same 3% budget that everybody else got, it may communicate to the employee that, well, yep, I haven't been, doing the best, but they're just giving everybody the same thing. So seems like what I'm doing is okay. I'm still increasing my earnings each year and I'm getting the same as other people. So we're going to phase in now to just doing a brief check-in on the coronavirus. So at this exact point in time, we're seeing more organizations starting to make their decisions about whether or not to welcome employees back, or some companies may be opening back up for the first time after being on a furlough or some type of shutdown. So our recommendation is that honesty and transparency are key with anything that you're doing, especially related to COVID. So employees value prompt, clear communication regarding the status. What is the organization doing? Why have you decided to open up your office now? Why are you still allowing employees to work from home? Or why are you doing, a split schedule? And it really helps to understand or explain why behind different decisions you've made. So if you've had to freeze pay, why have you done that? If you've had to do a furlough, why? And what is the expectation that you hope to have? Same thing for layoffs or even reductions in pay or a schedule. And once you do these things, it's really important for both the organization, but then managers at their team level to have regular updates to help alleviate rumors or gossip that are likely going to be happening with employees. Gossip exists in the absence of clear communication. Employees will create their own reality if we don't give them and continue to tell them what the real reality is. So that is the end of our webinar today. Please continue to join us for our live webinars. During those webinars, we are able to offer SHRM recertification credits, but unfortunately, those are not available during recorded webinars. If you have any questions about the Risk Source Lunch and Learn series, please check out the Risk Source website, or you can sometimes find information on our hrelements.com website as well. Thank you so much.